Joining me now is Michael Brooks of The Michael Brooks Show, also known as TMBS, and also a good friend of TYT and my friend. So what's up, Michael? How are you?
Hey, Anna. It's always great to talk to you.
I gotta admit, the clip that we're about to play infuriated me this morning, but it's really a good way of starting this discussion. So let me just give the audience a little bit of context before we go to this clip. There has been this mainstream media effort, and they've been working overtime to divide Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And what they do is they make it appear as though they're the same when it comes to policy, but one candidate is much more palatable than the other. Now, we know that both points are untrue, and we're gonna get into that after we play this clip. And just to give you guys context into what this clip is, it's from MSNBC over the weekend, where former US Assistant Attorney Mimi Rocah tries to make a point about why she dislikes Bernie Sanders. Take a look.
For me, as you know, again, I'm not the political analyst here, but just as a woman, probably considered a somewhat moderate Democrat, Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl. And I can't even identify for you what exactly it is, but I see him as sort of a not pro-woman candidate.
Wow. Great analysis there. So she doesn't even know what it is. She just knows that he makes her skin crawl. And prior to that comment, this panel, which consisted of 3 people and the host, it was a Bernie bash fest. There wasn't a single person on that panel that supported him, which I thought was fascinating because they're not even trying to do this false equivalency thing anymore. They're just outright bashing him.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, they hate Bernie Sanders and they have a total bias against Bernie Sanders, which is embarrassing. I mean, I am someone, obviously, like, I am purely in the opinion business. I'm a socialist, right? I'm sure some people, I can already hear certain fans of certain candidates whining and complaining, but I would never do a segment that was analogous to that. I couldn't tell you why. And I think that it's just something that makes my skin crawl. But the thing that's really amazing about it and really important is it's not just the disdain for Bernie Sanders, which is stunning and a double standard that you would never see for any other candidate. It's the disdain for what he represents and the tens of millions of people that he's speaking to and representing like no other candidate. That's a disdain that says, I don't understand why there's people who are really out here struggling, need a candidate to actually deliver for them. Because for me, politics is all just a TV segment. It's all just make believe and, hanging out with a very narrow set of people and gossiping about personality preferences. It's disgusting.
So we've seen great policy come from both candidates. Now, you and I are pretty honest about what our preferences are in terms of which candidate appeals to us the most. I really liked Elizabeth Warren's proposal when it came to student loan debt, and then Bernie Sanders came forward with something even better. And I've been very honest about that. When foreign policy comes into play, there are some significant differences between the two. But the conversation doesn't really have anything to do with that when you hear it happening on the mainstream media. The conversation really is between socialism and capitalism. And I want you to get into that a little bit because, of course, Bernie Sanders has no problem calling himself a democratic socialist, whereas Elizabeth Warren is a little different.
Yeah, I mean, I think they really do have different politics and a different worldview. And I absolutely, support Bernie Sanders for a variety of those reasons. I think he is making a more structural case. And I think he's making something that is much more simple and deliverable in a way. And I think you see that actually in the student loan cancellation proposals. Like his is just, let's just get rid of it. Let's do it, not create a new means test. But I think with regards, and those are really important conversations, obviously, particularly also when you get to the foreign and military policy, which I don't think we can separate from domestic policy. It's an interdependent process. But on the media, in a way, and I say this as obviously a very strong Sanders supporter and someone who does have some critiques of certain parts of Elizabeth Warren's policies, they're disrespecting her as well, because they're not talking about what she's putting forward. They're simply using her as a foil against somebody that they have weird psychological issues with and class aversion to. And so that is actually dangerous for her in the long term. Say she did sort of break ahead of Sanders in that scenario, that would be, terrible as far as I'm concerned. But say that happens. all of these people that are gassing her right now, just because they have this weird fixation with against Bernie in the media, I don't know how resilient that support would be. I mean, for some of them, maybe, but for a lot of them, probably not, because at the end of the day, as that woman in that clip herself said, she's a quote unquote moderate Democrat, which we all know what that means. She's, highly pro-corporate, I would assume.
During the Obama administration, he had nominated Senator Elizabeth Warren to be part of his cabinet, and the Republicans refused to confirm her nomination. I bring that up because the same concerns that those Republicans had about Senator Warren reining in, and at that point, by the way, she wasn't a senator. She decided to run as senator after Republicans pulled that stunt. But the reason why they didn't even consider her was because they did not like where she was coming from when it came to economic policies. Now, the same concerns that Republicans had there, I would argue, are the same concerns that you're seeing from these members of the mainstream media. So I think you're absolutely right in that they're so concerned with maintaining the power structure that we have in America today, the same power structure that puts people like us and average Americans at a disadvantage, that they absolutely would turn on her as soon as Bernie Sanders is out of the race. Right now, they're using this as a tool to divide the progressive vote, and I think it's abundantly clear. Sorry, that wasn't a question, it was more of a comment, but I want to get your thoughts on that.
I'm the sultan of comments as questions, so I feel you. But I think that, yeah, you're totally right about that. The question, though, that I do have that's a little bit more critical, though, is to Warren, right? I think the Warren campaign right now is making a calculation that they benefit from that dynamic.
Yes.
And I think that's leading people to question, when the story, in the beginning of the campaign, the stories were Wall Street says, nobody besides Sanders or Warren. Now those stories are changing. And I agree with you that those things could flip because obviously, as compared to the other candidates, she has a much more serious record about Wall Street. But I do think that what Bernie represents is not only more radical policy, which it is, but I think it's also somebody who doesn't kowtow to these people. It's like, look, I don't think you're necessarily smart. I don't think that you should have the power that you hold. I don't care where you went to school. I don't care how clever you are. And I don't think it's just as simple as dealing with corruption. We've got to deal with a bigger picture structure and problems. And that's why Bernie, has been willing, I think, also, in some ways, to me, it's not just that foreign policy matters a lot in of itself. It's another real yardstick of how courageous somebody's going to be, right? Like, if you're willing to go against foreign policy consensus on any number of issues, whether it's calling for freeing Lula, whether it's talking about the Middle East in a really smart, clear way, which isn't even particularly radical, it's just commonsensical, right? But is against the kind of standard talking points of a group like AIPAC or something like that, that shows a serious orientation. And I think these people smell that, and that's why they loathe and hate him so much. And I think that really is a dividing line. And we're going to have to start asking, like Senator Warren, I think, are you part of a kind of structural argument, or are you trying to kind of be like the progressive that Neera Tanden can be cool with as a way to like not have the whole thing really be broken and recreated, which I think we need.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I want to ask one other question about a story that's related, and it was making its rounds last Friday. So I first saw it in the Washington Post, this whole notion that Bernie Sanders is a hypocrite because he's underpaying his campaign workers. Now, if you do a deep dive in the story and actually investigate it yourself, he has a unionized campaign. He pays a living wage of $15 an hour. And the real argument was that people were working longer hours, so if you divvy up that wage with the longer hours, they're actually getting paid less. But what's the real story in terms of the climate within the campaign? Because it's being spun as if these campaign workers are really angry with Bernie Sanders and they really think he's a hypocrite, but that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, as far as my understanding from people that I do know some people in the campaign, there's a huge amount of cohesion and sense of shared purpose. And most of the kind of feedback that came out of that leaked story was, why would somebody do this when we were making progress and our negotiations, right? And I do think bigger picture, and it's not to say, I mean, look, you can critique anybody, whatever, good luck in people for anybody negotiating a better contract for themselves, right? But the notion that the media, which has systemically underplayed labor stories, period, including like the structural change of labor in this country, that have put so many people in such a worse position, all of a sudden is kind of fixated on this sort of little point settling about Bernie. Again, it's just so transparent and embarrassing. And we also have reporting, frankly, showing that, there's much more serious, sort of campaign compensation questions in Pete Buttigieg's campaign and Joe Biden's campaign and Elizabeth Warren's campaign. And so it just becomes like they will stop at nothing, and it's transparent and embarrassing. And I think people need to just be really clear about that.
It is pretty incredible because they don't attack those other campaigns, I think for two reasons. First of all, they like those establishment candidates, but also you're right in that they've never really been concerned about unfair wages. They're much more concerned with trying to spin something as hypocritical within Bernie's campaign. Now, final question for you is about the best way to move forward as a progressive voter, because I've struggled with this a little bit. I don't want to go out of my way to unfairly, well, no one should go out of their way to unfairly critique or criticize any candidate, but I don't want to play into this mainstream media narrative of dividing progressive voters. So what's the best way to move forward so you're not, going after a particular candidate or attacking them and destroying their chances?
I mean, to me, like, I think that we have to be somewhat comfortable. And I think that also people on the flip side also need to realize that there are different phases of a process, right? So right now, I think in a primary, it's really okay to sharpen and highlight the actual differences. And I think one of the difference between Sanders and Warren is that those differences are legitimate and philosophical and important. And there's a credibility to both sides, even as we strongly advocate. And then obviously, I think a lot of other candidates in this field, you can just really simply say, like, there's a reason that Cory Booker voted against drug imports from Canada, right? Like, there's a reason why so many of these candidates are totally on board for any type of corporate special interest agenda imaginable, let alone, of course, Joe Biden's just embarrassing history on every number of policy issues, but I particularly focus on bankruptcy and trade with him. But I think that people also need to realize that sharpening these differences and having clear critiques, especially if they're done in a personally respectful way, is really also, on the flip side, that's not the end of the world, right? Like people don't need to personalize it so much. We can have a critique, we can have an argument, and move it forward.
All right, Michael Brooks from The Michael Brooks Show, TMBS. Please check him out on Patreon. Michael, thanks so much for talking with us about this topic.
It's always a pleasure, Anna. Thank you.